let's go watch it in 2D. No, let's go watch it in 3D. But if we watch it in 3D, then is it worth the cost?
Hello. This is Adolph Vega, and today I'm doing an interview with Otyugra Games developer, and I'm talking to Matt. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
And Matt, let's get started. It's just some basic questions. Who are you, and what do you do?
All right. Hi, my name is Matthew Kordon. I am the founder of this small little game development company. In this company, I wear many hats. As far as like being the lead designer, being the art director, being public relations guy, as you can tell, and so forth. We make video games, but we're a small company.
Okay, so tell me about your background with game development.
Sure. I've been very interested in game design since I was a kid. I got into it through what was basically a predecessor to Super Mario Maker, if you know what that is. On the internet, there used to be a Flash game that was basically like a smaller version of Super Mario Maker. And I found it like really enticing. And from there, like I learned about like actual game development. And since then, for a couple years, I made games as a hobby. And I wasn't very good at it for a good long time. But I learned quite a lot, I think. And somewhat recently, in 2015, I decided to take it more seriously and to try to make games for profit. And just a few weeks ago, in fact, we registered our company and we became official, basically. And we are now starting on a 3DS video game that we are hoping to get a publisher for. I've made games in a couple different genres, but they've been all in 2D, and they've all been like indie games, usually with pixel art, but usually also with some degree of a lot of like passion, creativity, and I would say uniqueness to like the games that we make. We usually don't really design games too much with like whatever like trend is kind of like going through. I would in the past have like just whatever like cool idea would come across my mind. I would set about and like make a small game about it. And that was like a lot of like what I've done to get here, I guess.
Okay, so tell me about this new game you're making.
Sure. My team and I are making a game called Contraband, Deviant Duel Decks, or Contraband 3D for short. It's a game based off of the true events of life behind the Iron Curtain in the Cold War, Eastern Europe. It's about young adult punks who feel very much disenfranchised and unhappy with the way that things are in their country, and they want to basically like bring about like change. It's very much like a story written kind of like a young adult novel, but as a video game, you basically play as a teenage male who we haven't like given a name yet, and you go around your city basically, and you 3 times a day like plan what you're gonna do. Like if you're gonna hang out at like a pub or like go explore downtown where there's like rubble from like a past war, or like maybe go into the city and like talk to folks there. And beyond that, the game is also I want to say a trading card game, video game. But as far as I understand, I think trading card game is a copyright term by Nintendo, actually. So basically, it's like if you know what Yu-Gi-Oh is, a lot of the game is you challenge people, the characters the same age as your main character, to like a card game duel. And just a little bit like an RPG. It's kind of hard to describe if you don't really know a whole lot about card games. But like think of it as like a little bit of a mix between like say an RPG with like a 52 card like deck. How say like if you're playing Goldfish, for example, you have like different kinds of like cards in your hand, and you're trying to win against your opponent. Well, a card game basically, if you don't know, is like a much more like sophisticated like version of that. And the game is basically like it revolves around that, in that it has like all the features that video games about collectible card games traditionally have, like building your deck is a big part of the game, getting new cards, experimenting with different what are called archetypes, which is when a deck of cards has a special theme, which is usually like tied to like say maybe it might be like a theme about dragons, but it might also be a deck where you're trying to use a very specific strategy to win. And so like winning progresses the game, but also kind of unique to our game, unlike a lot of other card games, is that it's not very important that you win, and it's almost more so like a thing to pass the time and to get to know the NPC character that you're playing the card game against. One thing that we want to do is we want to have like a very realistic angle to this game, in which when you're playing against other people, it's a kind of a realistic scenario in which all it is just like two people with decks of cards, like talking to each other and like having like friendly competition, usually within a game, which is different from say if the audience, if you've ever seen the Yu-Gi-Oh TV show, which is a good comparison. How in that TV show there's usually like a huge amount of stakes, and like the card game has like holographic projectors, and like card games like decide like the fate of the world. Like instead of that, we kind of want to make like a game that like has like a realistic take of what it's like to be somebody who's really into card games, but to at the same time kind of take that very relatable and realistic like angle of playing card games, but set it in an interesting setting that is unlike what is like here and now. Does that answer your question pretty well?
Yeah. So how many cards do you expect to have in the game, or do you not want to reveal that?
At the moment we're thinking about, and that's actually a really good question, because that has like a massive effect on like what the game is like. We've observed that like card games that have like say 20 to 30 cards are like really quick, and like each card that you draw like could be like a game changer. That could be like the card that like, wins the game when there's only that many. And we've seen that there's some card games that have like as much as like 60 cards per deck, and that means that like cards could never show up, and so like random chance is like a huge aspect to games like that. So we're trying to do something that's closer to the middle. We're aiming for right now it's 30 to 40 cards.
Okay. Now, what systems will this be coming out on?
This will be coming out on new 3DS systems. So that would be and right now it's as far as we know, it's only going to be coming to North America, although we would like to expand. But as far as like, we can only really promise it's coming to North America, and as such, that means that we can only confirm that it's coming to new 3DS XL and new 2DS XL, or the new 2DS.
So, are you self-funding this, or is it through Patreon, or how do you do this?
I am mainly funding this myself. I have what is basically my business partner, even though I would say that I I'm definitely like the founder and like the main person, but like I guess kind of like you could say like the vice president, so to speak. My friend Trevor, he is not really able to contribute much as like my fellow business partners. So we have to kind of, because I only have so much money, I have to look outside of self-funding, and we are using Patreon to try to get as much money for development as we can, as kind of a stopgap until we are able to maybe get a publisher, or especially, in fact, we actually need kind of Patreon for beyond that too. You may not know that publishers tend to not give too much like funding. Actually, like publishers tend to help more so with like time management, some of the more like expert, kind of like as that they have a lot more experience with the business, and like have working relationships with say Nintendo, and are more capable to do things like make physical copies, and are significantly better at advertisement and stuff like that. So we were probably going to rely very heavily on Patreon to get our funding.
How does that work for you so far?
So far it has not been going too well, unfortunately. I have been trying all the different methods that I know, such as like advertising on Facebook with ads, reaching out to the Reddit community, which I think went well in a sense, because I think I think we can get to this later, but doing so made like a working relationship with people on the 3DS like Reddit community, who, by basically being like very personal about it, I was able to get a lot of people excited and like friendly with us. Unfortunately, that didn't like result in like many people funding us. Outside of that, I've also told some friends and family about it, and right now they're thinking it over.
Do you have any specific patrons that you currently have that you want to give a shout out to for helping you out so far?
So far we have one patron, who is our first supporter, who came from Reddit. Unfortunately, I don't know the person's username off the top of my head, but I definitely want to give a shout out to our very first patron, who, despite the fact that our Patreon page initially, we fixed it since then, but initially it wasn't very good. But despite that, they had a lot of faith in us, and this person is giving us $16 a month, and that is going to be so helpful.
Now, why did you say the new 3DS only? Or why don't you want to do the old 3DS as well?
Initially, we did want to do the original 3DS systems, but when looking into it, for all kinds of different reasons, we kind of realized that it makes more sense to do new 3DS only, at least from a development perspective. It definitely has the very massive drawback of being an unpopular opinion with like people at large, because it's honestly like really hard to describe why it's so much better like for us as developers to only do it for new systems instead of for all 3DS systems. One reason is the cost. For whatever reason, it's a lot cheaper to only develop for new 3DS systems, whereas it's very expensive to develop for either only original 3DS systems or both. So as you know, as like a company that doesn't have a lot of money, who's kind of struggling to get crowdfunding, it kind of makes sense for us to start small, to kind of match our budget. It also makes sense in that it means that we don't have to make two versions of the same game, like, and optimize each of them for both of the systems. When there's more systems to develop for, there's more things that can go wrong, and that can be kind of stressful. Beyond that, there's also the problem of having like less buttons could end up being restrictive for us. Having less power, like hardware power, could end up being a huge nuisance. It wouldn't be like impossible to get around that, but it would make things a lot more difficult for us as somewhat novice developers. I wouldn't say that we're like unprepared for this. I definitely think that we are. I also don't think that we're anywhere near as like experienced as what you would typically think of for a development team making a big 3DS game. But I would say I just remember though that the most important reason why is because developing for an original 3DS system is extremely harder. It's a lot less user friendly, and if you don't know a heck of a lot about coding, and if you don't have a lot of patience, then it can be like very overwhelming and stressful to try to program for original 3DS. And I think that has a lot to do with why there hasn't been a lot of like Western developers, people outside of Nintendo themselves who have tried to put their games on 3DS as compared to say the Switch, which is a lot easier for development. And so is the new 3DS systems. By comparison, they're very like easy to develop for and very user friendly. I think Nintendo really took that criticism to heart when they made the new 3DS system. So yeah, that's the reason why.
Now, regarding the new 3DS, we actually be using 3D for this game?
Definitely. We didn't set up like we definitely came up with this game idea with the 3DS in mind. But that being said, we didn't really think to we didn't really like plan on like 3D being like a very quintessential like aspect about it. But that being said, now that we've kind of realized the position we're in, it seems as though we might end up be making one of the very last somewhat large brand new like games for the 3DS, because it seems like these days Nintendo themselves have been porting like older games instead of like making new games for the 3DS. So as it kind of by coincidence, it seems like the game that we're making is kind of a big deal for that reason, that it's going to be like one of the last like big new important like games, I guess, for the system. And Nintendo themselves have been occasionally not putting 3D in their games. I've noticed in talking with the 3DS community, they've kind of pointed out that like a good handful of their games being ported do not have 3D anymore. That's not true for all of them, but for most of them. And so by virtue of having 3D, I think that like makes like our game kind of stand out for the better too. Our game doesn't really have a whole lot that really feels like it like needs 3D. And we're definitely not like experts when it comes to like programming like a three-dimensional like stereoscopic game. Because as we said, we are mostly used to doing two-dimensional games. But that being said, we definitely want to put care and like effort into the 3D aspect, even if it doesn't turn out to be all that like marvelous or like important to the experience. We still definitely want to like not neglect that, if that makes sense.
How is it to make the different layers of 3D? Would it hurt the gameplay because of, the frame rate, or how does that work? I don't know how the game development works with 3D.
That's a very good question. It's definitely not something that like Nintendo or really any other developer like really makes apparent. And unfortunately, because we're not too far into development, we don't have a very good idea of how it works. But just based off of our experiences as game developers and programmers, like I can. And by the way, I'm also a big part of the programming aspect of the games that we make. I'm the lead programmer. But anyway, so how 3D seems to work, as far as I understand, is there are like many layers, and things are like assigned to a layer, basically of like distance from your eye, I guess. Theoretically, like I don't. The way that it works, obviously, it's not like quite literally like physically like spread out, but like how your eye perceives it, I guess. And so with like a truly 3D game, we have to have many 3D layers, which is different than say, I know that in Fire Emblem Awakening, which is another 3DS game, I know that in that game, there are scenes when it's like 2D sprites, kind of like standing on top of a map, like a top view. And so, and like whenever that happens, when you're in a battle in that game, it's not too different than say like a 2D game. So there's not many layers being used, and so I would imagine that that's like less intensive than say having like a fully 3D game, like say Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time 3D. So because our game is definitely going to be completely 3D, I do think that that's going to be a little bit intensive, I guess. But the good thing about like developing for only new 3DS systems is that we have a lot of extra hardware to work with, and that should help us to keep the frame rates smooth and to keep them high.
Now, are you using the Unity engine? I know Nintendo recently made a big deal about the Unity engine and helping making games for the new 3DS and Switch. Has that been very helpful to you, or no?
Oh, absolutely. We aren't too far into the process, but even already, we definitely feel that Nintendo's relationship with Unity has actually been like a very good thing for developers. That's a huge part of why the Switch as well as new 3DS systems are so much more user-friendly to developers now than they used to be. And Nintendo, by the way, has a long history of being of making like consoles and hardware that is not at all friendly to like other developers. They have like an in-house research and development team, and so Nintendo has always like made their own consoles for themselves in mind instead of for everyone in mind. Which is kind of why it's like so difficult to make like an original 3DS game. But anyway, Unity, their like philosophy is to be extremely easy to understand and very with like people in mind, I guess, with new developers in mind too. And that being said, yes, our game is going to be made using the Unity engine, but using not the free version of the Unity engine. That's a very important thing to clarify. Unity gets kind of a bad rap from people who play video games because Unity is often associated with a lot of the not so good games to come out of indie games. And as not a perfect example, but as a recent example, Yooka-Laylee was made in Unity, and people were saying that was like a huge red flag. And the fact that the game turned out to be not to everyone's expectation, people kind of use that as like, see, I knew it. Unity is terrible, and everything made with Unity is going to be terrible. But I want to set the record straight and say that like a video game is only as good as the people making it, and it honestly has almost nothing to do with the engine itself. Because if the developers rely really heavily on the engine, and especially like the shortcomings of the engine, their game is going to reflect that and going to be of course it's going to look bad, but we're going to try very hard to make this game like you're not going to even like know it's Unity. You're just going to see the game for what it is, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, so is this coming out only on the Nintendo eShop, or is it coming out physical as well?
It's going to be coming out only on Nintendo eShop, as far as we know for now. We originally said that we were hoping to put it on physical copies, but having done more research into that, it's seeming more and more like that's not a sound financial decision to do, because it would require that we buy a much more expensive development kit. It would also require that we pay for each physical copy, like each cartridge. And you buy them in bulk, of course, but they're all the same. They're very expensive. And I've tried to do research into this, and it seems like an overwhelming majority of people may not like buying digital, but but if they don't have a choice, like if the game is digital only, they're willing to buy it that way. Like, in other words, we're not really missing out on too many people if we do digital, at least so like our surveys have told us so far.
Now, one thing about putting on digital, you get to be on the Nintendo press release every week for the eShop downloads, and it does. A lot of games are put in the quote unquote "also new this week" section, and it's kind of buried, and they're not featured by Nintendo. Do you know how to be featured by Nintendo in those press releases? Are you worried about sales being low just because you may fall into that, or were you worried about the Switch being taken over and not, or just kind of worried about sales in that front?
Yeah, it's definitely a very real fear. I think that's actually a really great question. That's I really like that question because it's definitely an important issue that we're having to tackle. Nintendo is very interesting in this regard. You hear this all the time, from people who talk about Nintendo, and in say podcasts. At least in my experience, the Nintendo is very much a wild card in it, and it's really hard to kind of read what they're going to do next. And even in looking at past events, I'm honestly not sure how they would look at a game like ours, because on one hand, it's probably going to have some of the drawbacks of a game made by a somewhat new development team, but at the same time, it is going to be a fairly large game. It is going to be published by somebody that you can trust. We're gonna work pretty hard to find a good publisher, and to so basically I don't know. I think that there's going to be a handful of positives and negatives about a game, I guess. And a part of that is that our game is going to be we're going to try to make this game from an artistic standpoint as well as as a business standpoint. So even though we're definitely very a big goal of ours is to make a game that's appealing to a very wide audience. In other words, we want this to be a game that quite a few people could look at and be like, oh, this is definitely something that would bring me joy. But at the same time, we also want to make a game that's that has messages that that you could say doesn't really play by the rules in a few ways. Just because we also kind of come from a background of being very interested in art games and experimental games and stuff like that. So I definitely think that that influence is going to have an effect on the game. And also because this is probably going to be a rated T or rated M game. And Nintendo seems to embrace those games these days, but I'm not sure if they would embrace a game like that for 3DS. I'm honestly really torn about whether or not Nintendo would be willing to feature a 3DS game in the future. And another reason why that's such an interesting question to me is because I think it's hard to know if Nintendo's support for the 3DS would be something that would motivate them to want to spotlight a game like this, or if maybe by a year or two from now, maybe they'll just completely give up on the 3DS by then, or maybe there'll be a successor. It's honestly hard to tell if so it remains to be seen if Nintendo is going to want to spotlight us or not. I definitely think just by virtue of being in the what's new catalog, I think that's going to definitely be very good for us. I think especially in compared to Steam on computers, you have a lot more visibility there than you would if you were a brand new game on Steam. So I definitely think even with the Switch doing so well, I think with just the sheer lack of competition on 3DS, I think seeing there's going to be a lot of people looking for a new game just every 2 weeks, say. And I think that's going to be a huge part of people discovering this.
Now, how exactly are you going to make your game stand out from the rest?
I think I definitely think that the core of what our game is going to be a big aspect of what makes it stand out immediately. I think the fact that to my knowledge there are very, very few games in the 3DS that are extremely story heavy. I would describe our game as a mix between a Yu-Gi-Oh video game and say Telltale's The Walking Dead, for example, because our game is very much about like making like dialogue choices and interacting with people and like in socializing with characters and making important choices that will like affect the outcome. That like that's a pretty big part of the game is like very gameplay light kind of story heavy kind of like moments. But the game is also combined with a like a card game. And the card game itself is going to be like fully fledged. It's not going to be like an afterthought. You know what I mean? So because like you can, just by the nature of being like a weird mashup of two genres, I think that is going to that's one thing that I think will help it to stand out. I think the setting and the mature subject matter is going to make it stand out. I have yet to say that this game is going to be very much focused on the main character's new relationship with a girlfriend. We want to take kind of a slightly different approach from a lot of like, say, romance visual novels, which are usually very much like wish fulfillment, and all about like getting a girlfriend as opposed to what happens after you have a girlfriend. We want this game to like kind of explore kind of somewhat realistically like what it's like to get into like an intimate relationship, and part of why it's like a say like rated T for teen or maybe higher, is that we I guess like we don't want to like hold back or like at least like kind of like the dialogue and the story and how like the characters interact. Like we don't want to like portray it like for like a mature audience, in other words. But of course, there's not going to be like anything that would be considered like adult only content, because that would basically mean that the game couldn't even be put on the eShop. So I think definitely having like very mature themes throughout the game, like I think the Cold War is in and of itself like an interesting and deep subject that I think would kind of make the game just kind of stand out. And you know, with the characters being punks, that too, that would, I think that would really grab somebody's attention if they just like saw saw like a screenshot of the game of like the characters just being themselves.
When will you start having screenshots and or video trailers of it? Do you think that's going to be happening soon?
No, the game is early in development, so we're probably not going to have much of either anytime soon.
Okay. Have you thought about using some other Nintendo 3DS features like Street Pass or Amiibo?
We thought about it, but it seems like as much as I don't want it to be so, it seems like the user base for 3DS is thinned out enough these days that that Street Pass doesn't get used very much. I feel like that's only going to get a little bit worse as time goes by. And so we're not thinking about investing in Street Pass features. And also for kind of the same reason why physical copies are expensive and outside of our plan, for a very similar reason, like Amiibo support would be outside of our like what we were able to do, and partially because Nintendo has like licensing rights to a lot of Amiibo. So like if say we wanted to have like a Yoshi Amiibo like in our game, just as a random example, that would require that we like do the licensing rights from Nintendo to have like Yoshi within our game. That would be much too expensive for the benefit.
Now, you said you're going to have it for the new 3DS. You're going to use all the shoulder buttons, even the C-Stick. How do you use the touchscreen in this game?
The touchscreen is very important to the experience, especially when you're in the card game itself. Card games can be very much improved, I think, when you're able to like drag things and tap things. One of my favorite card games of all time is called Elements, the game. It's a browser game and it's entirely mouse only. And so you could say that like a mouse is very much like touch controls. and part of why I like this card game so much is that just the user experience of using a mouse to play the game makes things like flow very naturally, and I think it's like a very important part to like experiencing it. I'd say, and so I think having the unique combination of physical buttons for more advanced kind of gameplay with the convenience of being able to use the touch controls, I think that's very much why we are putting this game on 3DS. We can't do that with like a mobile phone game, and we can't really do that with even the Switch, because the Switch has it so that their touch controls is very primitive, and it has to be optional. That's kind of like part of Nintendo's agreement with developers, is that if you make a touch control game on the Switch, it has to be an optional thing. And we really don't like the idea of like making touch controls non-essential. So yeah, I definitely think that like that's a huge part of the game, is like the touch controls. Like even outside of like card games, like using the menus and things, I think that would be like an important thing to like make the experience for the players better. But also, we don't have like a concrete plan for how we're going to use all the different buttons. But we're hoping to use each and every button in some important way. We definitely want to take advantage of the 3DS's hardware as much as we can. But we're not entirely sure how we're going to do that right now.
Now, I actually have never played a card-based RPG. I'm sorry. I know it's crazy, but is this something I can enjoy too?
Absolutely. We're actually we're trying to design this game, in fact, for people like yourself. We very much so want to appeal to an audience of people who more so really like 3DS games than say they do card games as a genre. We definitely want to appeal to card game players who are just kind of bored and looking for the next thing. And that's definitely a good 1/3 or more of our audience, but maybe a majority of our audience is we're trying to like get people who this would be their first card game, or people who aren't like super into card games. We really want to design this with people like that in mind. We want to make it so that the card game isn't too complicated, so that it's I guess kind of like easy to understand, and that's part of why like touch controls are important. As I think touch controls would make things like very intuitive for like a player who doesn't know a whole lot about a card game, as compared to like kind of like navigating awkwardly with like a D-pad, for example. And we definitely want to have the story aspect of the game be very appealing to anyone and everyone, kind of the same way as like had this been a fiction novel about the Cold War, you know, then that would obviously appeal to people of a huge age range, and really anyone that's looking for a good book, I would suppose. So in the kind of the same way, we're hoping that like the strength of the story will be the thing that like gets people to get the game. But then like when but they'll discover along the way that the card game itself is kind of designed with them in mind, that it's I guess kind of like it's kind of, we want to make it like so that it's exciting, and that it has pizzazz, and that it's fun even for people who are intimidated by like the complicated rules of Yu-Gi-Oh or kind of like the strange jargon of a card game. You know, like we definitely like really want to make this game for the everyman. If that makes sense.
Now, you say it's a card game. Now, how do you design each card? Are you going to be very simple, kind of like the traditional, you know, card games, like or are you going to make it more like, you know, Japanese mahjong, or, you know, how do you think about the cards in this card-based game?
Originally, we were toying with the idea of using cards from a 52 deck. So say like how you know how it's like a king, queen, jack, ace, 2 through 10. Like maybe like using cards like that, but then adding our own cards to it, and that would give people kind of like something to I guess like have as a like, you know, a lot of people like know how to play poker and such. So like maybe like we were thinking maybe that would be a good way to like help introduce people. We decided to scrap that idea, but we're definitely trying to make cards that are pretty traditional, I'd say. Like if you've ever seen Pokemon the trading card game, or Yu-Gi-Oh, or Magic the Gathering, if you've ever seen like a card from there, we're definitely basing our cards very heavily off of that, with having like each card has like artwork and a cool name, and each card has attack and some health. So like if a card runs out of health, it dies. Then you have to discard it. But if each card has like a normal attack that you can choose to just like attack using that attack. But optionally, there's also like special attacks that are better than normal attacks. And we're hoping that like players will start by like we'll try to give players cards that don't have many abilities, so that each card that they get is like easier to understand. But it's basically like you can choose to kind of play by like the simpler rules, but you might lose because you're not taking full advantage of the cards. But you can also kind of like learn the special abilities of each card that's like a living like person in your army, so to speak. And then there's cards that do like special things. There are cards that like act as things that like do something for the entire game. There are cards that like attack your opponent directly instead of being like part of your army. So you might be like a thunderstorm, or it might do like 2 damage to every army card on the opponent's field.
So, like for example, Wolverine from Marvel's X-Men, you could theoretically use Wolverine's claws as an attack, or Wolverine's healing power.
Yeah, if a Wolverine was like a card that you could play in this game, I think he'd definitely be in our card they're called vessels, so they're basically like people is a good way to think of it. So he would be like someone on your army, so to speak, and he would have like a base attack where he uses his claws, but he might have like an ability where each turn he heals by such and such amount. It would require there's different kinds of cards. Some cards don't require anything and you can just kind of play it. Some cards require a certain amount of a resource to buy, so to speak. Like you get like a certain amount of resource, each turn, and with that you can spend that to place a card on the field or to use it. So Wolverine might have like a special attack that he can only do so many times per game, but that attack might be better than the normal attack. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just want to try to give it like a more concrete kind of thing. But you know what I'm saying. I think we're in agreement there. So, do you have a price or release date, or release range, or price range?
Unfortunately, we don't have like good idea for either one of those. We originally said that we want to have this game out in 12 months, but in reflection, we're not sure if we're going to be able to make that goal. In fact, it might take a lot longer than that, so we don't want to have like an official release date, and we definitely don't know what the price is going to be quite yet.
Now, since it's going to be on the 3DS and it's going to be a portable, have you thought about making it very portable friendly? You know, ability to quick save, ability to pop in, pop out kind of thing, because I know a lot of portable games fail because they don't think about that. And that's one of the features of the 3DS, going to sleep real quick and being able to, play a game real quick in 5 minutes or 10 minutes and then, being done. Have you thought about that?
Yeah. We haven't thought about it too hard, but we are lucky enough to say that the game is designed naturally as if it would really benefit like short play times and putting it down and picking it back up. The game is structured so that there are kind of like 3 sections of a day, and then there's like nighttime, which is kind of like a cutscene, sort of, kind of. And there's the morning, there's the midday, and then there's the evening. And because like each day is broken up into like small parts, You have many opportunities to save the game and to turn it off. And I've always been like really into games that are geared towards like short playthroughs. Unfortunately, I'm very busy these days, so I gravitate towards games that are very easy to like pick up and put down. But I still really like games that are kind of beefier and bigger, which is kind of why I really like, say, a 3DS game more so than a mobile phone game. Not that there's anything wrong with mobile phone games, but mobile phone games are very much very casual and simple. And so I like that the 3DS has found kind of a balance with some of its games that are both more intense, you could say, but they're also still something that you can pick up and put down. And I really want to have and because I really love games like that, I think that's naturally going to influence like the design of this game. And the card game itself, because it's relatively simple, and because the card games don't last very long, if you put your 3DS in sleep mode right in the middle of a card game, you can pick it back up and very easily know what to do next, because the card game doesn't require very much thinking ahead. It's not like a chess game where it benefits you to think like to be like 3 moves ahead of your opponent. You can certainly do that, I think. I think like players who like really care about this, they're bound to find interesting combinations and to take it seriously enough that if you really wanted to, you could think many turns ahead. But to win a card game, you really don't need to do that. So I think being able to just like start the card game right in the middle, you would know where you left off, and it would be perfectly fine. Likewise, card games aren't so long that you would have to do that very often. You could pretty easily like finish the card game and then save the game afterwards. Because I would imagine that card games don't last a whole lot longer than, say, a Pokemon battle. Like if you have say 5 Pokemon on your team and your opponent also has 5 Pokemon, I would honestly say that sounds more or less like the length of what a card game would be in our game.
Okay, so you did mention Russian and a relationship. Have you thought about actually getting a historian or getting an actual Russian or getting a woman to actually, help with the story elements to make it more authentic?
That's a very good question. The main problem that we're faced with is that we don't really have the budget for something like that, unfortunately. As of right now, that's very much likely to change, especially like if we get a publisher. I feel like that would really help out with that too. We definitely do want to, at the very least, consult with real life people who know a thing or two about these things. As it just so happens, I know quite a bit about history. I'm not a history major at my university. I'm 22 years old, by the way. But I do just so happen to know a whole lot about history. And it's very easy to research that sort of thing. However, writing a female character really well is something that I think would definitely benefit from having like a female writer, or having like people that I can like consult with and talk to. I have a little bit of experience myself in relationships. But I've learned the hard way that like what a healthy relationship is a very tricky thing, and to nail that down perfectly is going to be something that is going to be really hard. I think, and that also because I think that's a pretty big part of the game is telling a story about what a realistic intimate relationship with a girlfriend is like.
Okay. Have you thought about doing voice acting for this game? How are you doing the music?
We are not going to do voice acting for this game, slightly because I've never really. I've always kind of been a believer in like a text box is just as good as voice acting sometimes. The same way as like some people like prefer like a novel over an audiobook, in the same kind of way, or say like a comic book. So we don't really kind of like view voice acting as like a very, very important thing, especially given the budget that we have. And in my experience, I know that voice actors can be a very difficult thing to put into a game because of like all the many steps involved. And voice acting is just like something that like a small team like us, even with a publisher, don't have an interest in. As for, I'm sorry, what was the other thing that you asked?
The music. How are you going to do it for this game? Is it going to be like chip tunes? Is it going to be just what kind of themes do you have? Like, is it going to be like Russian based or what?
So we're thinking that the setting is going to be like a fictional country within Europe. We were trying to tell a story about Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe as opposed to Russia itself, which is kind of an interesting thing because that basically means that we're tackling a setting that has like Russian influence, but also just for a random example, maybe like German influence because it might take place in a country inspired by Germany. But as for the music, we're thinking about maybe having more, say, like very like atmospheric music, music that would in some way, for some parts of the game, that would kind of like fit, like say, like a movie score. For example, like if the main dude is like walking down the street and it's a really windy day, then we might like play up the fact that the wind is blowing really hard, and there may not be anyone around in the scene, for example. So the music might be like very subtle, you know what I mean? But then say if they're maybe in a bar, there could be like muffled like 80s music playing. It could be like a lot of 80s music is kind of like slow and bittersweet. But then again, because these are punks that we're talking about, there might it's like, especially during the card game itself, there's definitely going to be like punk rock, even if it's like without lyrics. And I think that's definitely going to be like a part of the soundtrack too.
Now, since it's going to be on the 3DS and have a dual screen element, have you thought about having to do menus and how to organize your game in two different screens?
Yeah, we think that with the card game, your opponent is going to be on the top screen and you're going to be on the bottom screen, which kind of works out. It's usually what happens. But that works out really nicely because it allows us to use touch controls for your part of the screen, but you wouldn't even need to use touch controls for their part of the screen. And here again is a reason why we think the 3DS is better for this game than, say, the Switch. Because with the Switch, it's kind of awkward to hold it vertically so that it looks kind of like the 3DS. With the 3DS, kind of like in real life, like if you're sitting at a table and you're playing a card game, like far into the distance is where your opponent is and where his side of the field is, and then close to you is where your side of the field is. So it would not really feel as natural to have like a card game go from left to right. But then outside of that, we definitely want to use the bottom screen for stuff like menus, for information, and but also like if you're in a conversation, like that could be where the text goes, but then you could see the scene of the people talking in the top screen.
Okay. So how big do you want this game to be? Like a 20-hour game, a 10-hour game? You're going to have a lot of replay value? Just kind of thinking about that, how to make a value for the customer.
Right. We definitely hope that the branching story paths and the very I don't really know how to describe this any other way. I kind of think of like card games as like Play-Doh. Like there's a lot of things that you can. That's just kind of just the first thing that came to mind is that there's like a lot that you can do with Play-Doh. In the same way, there's a lot of different decks that you can make. Say kind of in a similar way to in Pokemon, there's a lot of different Pokemon teams that you can assemble to have with you, and you can constantly change that up. You can put a Pokemon in your storage box, and you can capture a new one if you want some change. The same kind of way, I think that lends our game a lot of replay value, and especially because the game is, we think, at least for now, we don't know if we're going to keep this decision, But as of now, the game is on like a certain amount of days, kind of like how Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask has 3 days. Our game might have like several weeks. And when that time period ends, a big event in history happens. And depending on what you're at and what you do, basically depends on whether or not you can say that you were on the right side or the wrong side of history, basically. And so that's basically like how you get like a good ending or like a bad ending. And so I think like if you might want to experiment like what happens if I get a bad ending, or maybe I didn't play so well the first time. Like what happens if I play a little bit differently the second go round as this character. So yes, I think that would really help with like replay value. We don't really have a good idea of the size of the game. We're very cautious with making sure the game doesn't get too big for what we're capable of. We definitely think as long as the game is sized appropriately, we can make it a very good game. But if the game is like too big for what we can handle, then it's gonna fall apart, or it might not be a very good product in the end. Which kind of sucks because I mean, obviously everyone likes a bigger, more exciting game. But if we can only make kind of a somewhat small game, not like very small, but like kind of somewhere in the middle, if that's what we're the extent of what we're capable of, then that's what we're gonna do.
Now, I found you on Reddit. Have you been on Reddit for years, and do you want to continue using Reddit as a platform to help get people the information out to the people?
Yeah, we definitely think Reddit is a big important part of our strategy. We want to establish a working relationship with like actual 3DS fans through Reddit, because Reddit is such a great place to get a very massive gathering of people who are interested in the same thing. And we want to kind of like make a point of not being like other developers, because a lot of other developers are very much like mysterious and like separated from the fans. You know, like they'll like maybe make like they'll have like say a Twitter where they like tweet out like promotional stuff, but they won't like interact too heavily with the community. We want to have like a very big like community focus, especially because we're using Patreon over say instead of something like Kickstarter. Because Patreon too is very much like a community oriented thing. And we care very deeply about like befriending people on Reddit, and because like you said, I have been using Reddit for a long time now, and I feel like I've become like just a very ordinary like person on Reddit. So as such, I think I'm able to like talk to people about my game without it coming across as me being like a cynical business person. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Now, what are some of your favorite 3DS games?
Ooh, I really like the Fire Emblem games. I was introduced to it thanks to the 3DS. In fact, it's a big reason why I bought a 2DS several years back. I really like Fire Emblem Awakening because that game is, in my opinion, very well-rounded. I like Fire Emblem Birthright a little bit more than Fire Emblem Awakening, largely because like even though that game is a lot more rough around the edges, I think it at its best it's a better game than even Awakening is, and that says a lot because like a lot of people agree that Awakening is one of the very best 3DS games, and not a lot of people would agree with me that Fire Emblem Birthright is a really great game. Maybe from like a game design perspective, maybe it's not. But there, for example, there's a lot of little things that I think it does right. Like there's some story moments that I think are really great. I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
No, just wondering what other games.
Oh yeah, sure. Luigi's Mansion, New Moon is a good game. I really like that. It's a very good take on what like a point and click adventure game could be. Let's see what else. I really like The Binding of Isaac, and I really like a lot of other indie games that are on 3DS, and that is part of why I'm making one myself, is because like I was very inspired by like eShop only games. I was surprised by like how good so many of them are.
What are your favorite games of all time? Like top 3?
I would definitely put BioShock in that list. I think that's another example of a game that like balances having a very compelling story, very good gameplay. It's kind of, I have like somewhere around like 11 or 12 games that I would say are like my favorites, so it's kind of hard to pick like 3 out of that list. Definitely BioShock.
Any Super Mario games you know of?
Yes. As I told you, like making Super Mario levels was how I got into game design. I really like New Super Mario Brothers for the DS. In fact, it's probably like one of the only DS games that I actually like really fondly remember and like. And it's I think it was just like a really solid. It didn't really do a whole lot new, but I think it like was just a really good game, and it knew what it was, and that was good enough for me, I guess, as a kid.
Okay, well, thank you for your time and for this great interview. We will definitely be putting a link to your Patreon in the information box, so that way anyone that's listening could go ahead and be part of this. Thanks again. Do you have anything else you want to mention before we go?
Yeah. Thank you very much for listening to my game. I know that our game is far from release at the moment, so it really means a lot if you guys took interest in our humble little game. And seeing as you guys are fans of like the 3D aspect of the 3DS, I think that's really great. I definitely think that I really hope that the 3DS stays around for a while, because I think the 3D aspect of it is a really wonderful thing that it's a shame that the Switch doesn't have that. So yeah, thank you for listening.
All right, bye.
Bye.
All right, before this podcast ends, I want to give a thank you to my patrons. Right now, we have one patron, which is David from Spain, and I want to thank you for your financial support. All right, so that's going to be it for this podcast.
We now have a Patreon, and the link is in the description. Thanks for watching.
And we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, a little bit everywhere. Just look for us, 3D or 2D. And of course, review us on iTunes. And if you want to write us a letter, our email address is email3dortwo d@gmail.com. So that's going to be it. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye. Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.